It is with great pleasure that I now ask you to invite with me Father Frank Brennan to give his address.
Thank you for that welcome, Ian. Good afternoon, fellow panellists, ladies and gentlemen. Great to be with you to answer the question, is our morality at sea with refugees? The short answer is yes, and it will be for many years to come, although, of course, we may solve it all here by lunchtime. I start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I, you may have noticed, have not said anything about this issue for about the last 6 months, that is, since the last election. As I said to my friends, there was no point. Basically, both sides of politics had decided they would stop the boats, whatever it took. No one in Canberra has been the least interested in moral, ethical discussion about this issue. It's been a purely pragmatic question, what works? And if it doesn't work, we're not interested in speaking to you. But 6 months on, it's probably timely, particularly on Palm Sunday, and particularly in a church, to be reflecting on the question. I'll just speak for 20-25 minutes, but I have a longer paper which is available on the Eureka Street website. Let me start with the moral challenge from Scripture and religious authority. Just after John Howard had successfully implemented his Pacific Solution Mark I, stopping the boats with hindsight with more bluff than actual shock and awe, and bear in mind, Pacific Solution Mark I cannot be repeated because a bluff cannot be repeated, and therefore anything which is to be instituted now in the name of stopping the boats will be far more repressive than anything that was put forward in 2001. But back then, when John Howard had instituted that solution with the bluff, don't bother heading for Australia, you'll never be able to settle here, and guess what? Most of those proven to be refugees under that arrangement ultimately did settle in Australia or New Zealand. I was at an Anglican church in Tasmania, and I referred to Luke 16:26. Abraham said, "Remember, my child, that all good things fell to you while you were alive, and all the bad to Lazarus. Now he has his consolation here, and it's you who are in agony. But that's not all. There's a great chasm fixed between us. No one from our side who wants to reach you can cross it, and none may pass from your side to us." Seeking to implement a Christian response to refugees and asylum seekers on our doorstep, I said back then that we might contemplate the present Australian version of the parable of Dives and Lazarus. So it's Luke 16 with what I would call a contemporary Australian gloss. Let me share it with you. There was once a rich man who dressed in purple and the finest linen and feasted in great magnificence every day. At his gate, covered with sores, lay a poor man named Lazarus, who would have been glad to satisfy his hunger with the scraps from the rich man's table. Even the dogs used to come and lick his sores. One day the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up, and there far away was Abraham with Lazarus beside him. "Abraham, my father," he called out, "take pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water to cool my tongue, for I am in agony in this fire. And remember that I overlooked Lazarus at my door, only because there were many other people on the other side of the world who were in even greater need. I wanted to dispense charity and justice in an orderly way, not rewarding queue jumpers like Lazarus, who is now with you." As you'd be aware, Pope Francis has been very prophetic on this issue. One of the first things he did was go to Lampedusa, the European equivalent of Christmas Island. As I would say, it's the equivalent of a new archbishop or whatever going to Christmas Island as his first pastoral visit. It would be a powerful statement. When he went to Lampedusa in July last year, Francis said this: "We've fallen into the hypocrisy of the priest and the Levite, whom Jesus described in the parable of the Good Samaritan. We see our brother half dead on the side of the road, and perhaps we say to ourselves, 'Poor soul,' and then go on our way. It's not our responsibility. And with that we feel reassured, assuaged. The culture of comfort which makes us think only of ourselves, makes us insensitive to the cries of other people, makes us live in soap bubbles, which, however lovely, are insubstantial. They offer a fleeting and empty illusion which results in indifference to others. Indeed, this leads to the globalization of indifference. A few weeks later, he went to the big Jesuit church in Rome, the Gesù, the basement of which is the base for our Jesuit refugee service, which provides meals and medical help to all of those asylum seekers on the streets of Rome. There, after listening to their stories, he said, "After Lampedusa and other places of our arrival, our city Rome is the second stage for many people. Rome should be the city that allows refugees to rediscover their humanity, to start smiling again." We might say the same of Melbourne. Those of us schooled in the Christian tradition often contemplate the parable of the Good Samaritan, as Francis did when at Lampedusa. The parable works well for one stray Jew fallen by the wayside in desperate need. It works even better when the travelling Samaritan has access to a trusting Jewish innkeeper who will offer credit on spec. But it does need some imaginative discernment once we postulate hundreds fallen by the wayside, millions even more desperate in faraway places, and institutional innkeepers who have shareholders or voters to satisfy. The gospel message of charity and justice must always be prophetic, pedagogical and practical. The democratically elected leaders of a robust pluralist nation such as Australia have to accept that they cannot help everyone in need on the planet, and they're elected to maintain secure borders and a standard of living for our citizens which could not be emulated for all persons on the planet. I'd like to share with you part of the homily I gave at the Ecumenical Service in Canberra for the opening of the parliamentary session in 2010 for the hung parliament. People like Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott were there in the congregation. I was assured that my words had some substance, but I'd have to say some years later that none of my prayers was answered. This is part of what I said. As you prepare for those countless divisions in the Reps and the Senate, we all have cause to reflect this morning on that one great division called by the Son of Man coming in his glory, which you'll recall from Matthew 25. Much like the shepherd putting the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Each of us is to be judged by the times we visited the prisoner, gave food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, a welcome to the stranger, clothing to the naked, and medical and pastoral care to the sick. As legislators, you are better situated than most of us to affect the outcomes for many more prisoners, strangers, the sick and the poor. For every prisoner you help, there'll be hundreds beyond the purview of your concern. For every stranger you welcome to these shores, there'll be thousands you can't. And for every poor person to whom you give a helping hand, there'll be tens of thousands who need more. How then are we to be judged? Yes, you'll face your family and friends when you go home at the end of each parliamentary session. You'll face the people at the next election. You have to face yourself in the mirror every morning. And many of us believe we'll have to face our loving God, who says consolingly, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to the least one of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." As we wrestle with the demands of justice and the common good, let's always make a place and accord a respectful hearing to all our fellow citizens, whatever their religious or philosophical worldviews. May the most reasonable of legislators accord respect to the most devout citizens of faith. May the Parliament, our airwaves, our social media platforms and our public squares be places where charity and truth temper our passion for politics, while that passion enhances our commitment to truth and charity for all. I was preparing this address last Monday at home, where we've had a builder at the Jesuit house in Canberra. And this builder, he has a radio which he turns up very loudly, and he listens to radio announcers Ray Hadley and Alan Jones. I must confess, though I've been in public life for probably 30 years or more in Australia, I'd never listened to these people. But they really do enjoy plying their trade, don't they? And on Monday, they had one of their regular guests with them, namely Mr. Scott Morrison, the Minister for Immigration. Now, together, Ray Hadley and Morrison, they defended our borders and repelled threats from every quarter. They rejoiced that no boats had arrived in Australia carrying asylum seekers without visas during the last 15 weeks. But there was more, and I want to share with you a couple of samples of what I heard. What I'm going to suggest to you in this section of the paper is that most of us, in terms of our own personal ethics, would ascribe to the view that the end does not justify the means. Not even Jesuits would ascribe to that view. Now, in public life, often our elected politicians will take the view that there are circumstances in which we have such a noble end to be achieved that there will be some means which we will regret, but we say it's the only way to achieve the objective. I mean, one of the easiest ones that comes to mind, particularly in a democracy like Australia, is where regularly we will endorse the idea that our members of parliament will commit our troops to war in a foreign country for our long-term defence interests. Now, that is clearly a case of using a means to be justified in the light of the ends. Now, just to take a few of the instances of what I regard as the collateral cost of the unscrupulous means which are at the moment being adopted in order to stop the boats. Let's for the moment concede, for the purposes of argument, that stopping the boats is an ethically acceptable objective, but we'll come to that later. But even if we accept it's an ethically acceptable end to be achieved, what is the cost which is being undertaken in order to achieve that end? Well, just a sample of things being said. They turn their discussion to Cambodia. Mr. Morrison said, "Up in Cambodia, we've continued our discussions there about regional cooperation, and I think it raises important issues about resettlement. And the whole idea of resettlement for refugees is they don't get a one-way ticket to a first world economy. It's supposed to be to protect people from persecution, now, whatever country that may be in, that's the focus of protecting people from persecution, not providing a passageway to a first world economy." Now, I worked in Cambodia in 1995 for our Jesuit refugee service, establishing the first process for the determination of refugee claims. I go back there fairly regularly. I was back there in 2009-10, at the time when the Cambodians were forcibly repatriating Uyghur refugees to China. They were proven refugees. Cambodia had just put in place its refugee protection regime, but the Chinese officials were now arriving the next day with a $2 billion aid package, and part the cost was to repatriate these Uyghur refugees. No one in their right mind could seriously suggest that Cambodia is an appropriate place with its gross human rights violations and with the present state of the Hun Sen regime for placing those who are proven refugees. Now, we know why this is happening. It's because part of the cost, what was undertaken, was to say we would send people to Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Kevin Rudd said it in July last year, and Mr. Abbott has simply furthered it, that people in Nauru, once proven to be refugees, would be resettled in Nauru. Now, the obscenity of this, the cost of it, you simply have to bear this in mind. If that was to be pursued, Nauru would have to resettle a refugee population in the next 2 years within its own borders, the equivalent of the size of 10% of their population. Now, imagine saying to Australia, look, we have a checkbook here, and we want you to accept 2 million refugees to resettle in Australia within the next 2 years. It's clearly absurd. It can only be done as a figment of the imagination. So they're now going to process these refugees in Nauru, but they have nowhere to put them because they've said they cannot come back to Australia. We cannot just repeat the Howard bluff. And so what we have to engage in is a Rudd-Abbott exercise in shock and awe. But the cost of it is horrendous. Or consider the situation in Papua New Guinea. The idea that we will permanently resettle people in Papua New Guinea. Anyone who's spent time in Papua New Guinea knows it's not an appropriate country in which to expect people from Afghanistan, Iraq and Iran to find a permanent home. If they're given a permanent home, make no mistake, part the cost to Australia in the longer term will be if you consider the situation in the Torres Strait. We have a very porous border in the Torres Strait for very proper reasons, namely that the Torres Strait Islanders like to entertain their wontoks from Papua New Guinea who come in the little tinny boats in order to come fishing and share in the fruits of their vegetable gardens. And it's only a very short trip. We're going to have to militarise that border. We're going to have to try and render it absolutely secure in the name of stopping the boats from Indonesia. These sorts of costs are horrendously high. And so what we have is a situation where even if we concede that the end which is to be achieved at the moment, the cost which we're undertaking, I think, is so great as to cause us to question again that end which is to be achieved. Let me now come to seeking a moral path in the midst of intractable issue of people flows. According to the UNHCR, there are probably about 29 million people who are internally displaced in the world at the moment. There are 15 million refugees, and almost 1 million of these people are asylum seekers. Now, there's no way, of course, that Australia can accommodate all of these. Now, in terms of moral ethical argument, I accept that there are two streams of thought, both of which are defensible. The first are those people who argue that it's immoral for nations now to maintain sovereign borders and that we should permit the free flow of people much as we would allow the free flow of capital and produce in an increasingly globalised world. In my own Catholic tradition, Pope John XXIII was the last exponent of this in his 1963 document, Pacem in Terris, where he spoke of the right not only to emigrate, but the right to be a migrant in any country of your choice. In my own tradition, that's not been repeated since 1963. Now, there are some of us who are idealists who say it's time to get rid of national borders. But on the alternative, I do think there is still a coherent moral ethical case that can be made for national borders. And if we are going to propose national borders, one of the things which is essential is to acknowledge that if you maintain national borders, you are entitled to set up and to maintain an ordered migration program. And if you're a country like Australia, that should include a healthy component for humanitarian cases, including refugees. The second caveat to your national border policy is that if you have people who are in direct flight from persecution, then you are obliged to take them in and to give them the necessary protection unless and until it's safe for them to go home. Unfortunately, I think part of our debate in Australia has been somewhat sidetracked by the failure of many refugee lobbyists, if I might say, to acknowledge that under the international law, to which Australia is voluntarily a signatory, there is no right as such of an asylum seeker to enter the country of their choice. And this is something which is publicly not sufficiently understood. The Australian government website is correct when it states the following: international law recognises that people at risk of persecution have a legal right to flee their country and seek refuge elsewhere, but does not give them a right to enter a country of which they are not a national, nor do people at risk of persecution have a right to choose their preferred country of protection. In the medium term, the medium to long term, I think where we should ethically be focused is trying to reach an arrangement with Indonesia where we would then be justified in intercepting boats on the high seas, safely returning people to a queue which actually has been created in Indonesia, and where there would be an appropriate level of processing and protection. Now, at the moment that's impossible, in part because of our fraught relationship with Indonesia. But I think in ethical terms, that's something which in the longer term we should be seeking to achieve. Now, I acknowledge there will be some, including many refugee advocates, who say that's ethically objectionable and that basically our borders should be open. I am not one who subscribes to that report. The second thing which I think is a relevant ethical consideration is this. If we think back to July 2008, there was agreement in our Parliament, and this is often lost sight of. Not only did Kevin Rudd undo the Pacific solution, but Brendan Nelson's opposition agreed with it. They said, well, give it a go. And it was given a go. But it did prove to be disastrous in terms of the ongoing flow of boat people. Just consider the annual arrivals rates after July 2008. 2,856, 6,689, a brief drop to 4,730, then up to 17,271, and then up to 25,145. By the time Rudd took his action in July 2013, the arrival rate was 3,300 a month. That is 40,000 per year. And there was credible intelligence available to say that the people smuggling model, which was now at work in Indonesia, would see that escalate to anything to 50 to 60,000 in a year to follow if no action was taken. Now, if you're committed to maintaining a migration policy, which you run, including humanitarian cases, if you're receiving 50 to 60,000 boat people a year, you don't have any humanitarian component left in order to assist, for example, women in need in remote camps or refugees in parts of Africa where there's no access to people smugglers. So indeed, it becomes a very fraught question. So where do we go from here, given what we've seen and what's now in place with the agreement of government? I've spoken about what might be done in the medium to longer term. In the short term, what's been adopted is not the John Howard bluff, but rather a shock and awe Rudd-Abbott approach, which is to say that most definitely we will not resettle in Australia anyone who arrives by boat. I would suggest a number of things. Bear in mind that Labor in its last year in office increased the humanitarian component from 13,750 to 20,000 places, with 12,000 of those places being allocated to refugees offshore and 8,000 for refugees onshore. Now, during the election campaign, the Abbott coalition abandoned the commitment to that escalation of number of places and put it back to 13,000. So, I would suggest that ethically these steps need to be taken. First, Tony Abbott should commit his government to restoring good diplomatic relations with Indonesia, to initiate discussions with Jakarta with an eye to a negotiated agreement with both Indonesia and Malaysia aimed at upstream improvements. Second, the Abbott government should return its commitment to a humanitarian quota of 20,000. Third, we should acknowledge that there were many people on the high seas at the time Rudd announced his shock and awe who had not heard the message, and it is quite unjust to visit upon them a punitive regime of which they hadn't even heard. Fourth, in relation to the situation of children, particularly unaccompanied minors, we as a nation should say never again. The placement of unaccompanied minors in places like Nauru and Manus Island is just a cost way too far. Fifth, there is a need for safeguards to be put in place in Nauru and Manus Island which can protect the human rights of individuals who are there. The obscenity we were treated to recently, where the Australian Federal Police said they couldn't even respond to a request from the Papua New Guinea Police to provide a witness to oversee the cross-examination of people who were suspected of having killed the asylum seeker there in Manus Island. Seventh, the government should commit itself to prompt processing onshore of Papuan asylum seekers, in that no matter how good we get the arrangement with Indonesia, it has to be acknowledged in moral terms that any Papuans who flee here are in direct flight of persecution in Indonesia, and therefore they require our assistance. So, to conclude, I think we're going to be in a moral morass on this issue for some time to come. But in the short term, I don't think there's any way those of us who march today are going to reverse the Liberal Party or the Labor Party on a commitment to stopping the boats. But the cost of what's been put in place at the moment is going to be horrendous for a long time to come. And in ethical terms, I think the best we can do is say, right, you're committed to stopping the boats. If you do succeed in stopping the boats, then we think that there are 4 things that you must do with the dividend that you have received from that. And they are: first, invest the dividend from no boats arriving in measures aimed at enhancing processing and protection in the region, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia. Second, increasing the humanitarian quota for refugees and persons at risk offshore coming with an approved visa. Third, attend to the needs of those persons damaged by long-term detention, whether offshore or onshore. And 4, commit to reinstating the rule of law and social harmony in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. We have completely trashed the rule of law in Nauru, and we have completely trashed the prospect of social harmony in Papua New Guinea with the placing of these people coming out of these horrific circumstances there on Manus Island. We should abandon talk of taking Australia off the table. There's no way we can take Australia off the table in our globalised world without taking it off the planet. We should also abandon talk of taking the sugar off the table. The collateral damage of that is too great. The best way we can ethically and practically do this is to put the sugar out of reach while leaving it on the table for those who make it here with a visa or those in direct flight from persecution. We need to design a system on the high seas where it would be ethical to intercept and turn back those who come without a visa. That will require a system of regional processing and protection, especially in Indonesia, which would entitle us to say that everyone except Papuans arriving from Indonesia by boat are engaged in secondary movement seeking a more benign migration outcome. So, let's pray, let's recommit ourselves to resolute action as we contemplate Abraham's call. Remember, my child, that all the good things fell to you while you were alive, and all the bad to Lazarus. Now he has his consolation here, and it's you who are in agony. But that's not all. There's a great chasm fixed between us. No one from our side who wants to reach you can cross it, and none may pass from your side to us. It's time to reduce the chasm between here and Nauru, between here and Manus Island, and between here and Indonesia. Thank you.